Thank you. I appreciate all of you sticking around for the last session in this conference. Today I will be revisiting a topic that I think was discussed at the beginning of this conference yesterday, the outlook for Copenhagen. And in particular, I will focus on, in particular, the role of the United States and in China in moving forward over the next few months toward a Copenhagen agreement, and in particular how the engagement of the US and China are really inextricably linked. Of course, the US and China are important in any global climate deal from a sheer scientific perspective in terms of the share of their global emissions. Of course, together the US and China are the two largest emitters of energy-related CO2, and together account for almost half of these emissions. But the US and China, while often muttered in the same breath as the two largest emitters, are of course very, very different countries and in very different situations. If you look just at emissions on an annual basis, China comes out number one. But of course, if you look at, from a historical perspective, at the cumulative emissions up in the atmosphere today, which is what of course matters from a scientific perspective, as CO2 remains in the atmosphere for perhaps a century or more, the US is much farther ahead of China in terms of contribution to historic emissions. And of course, on a per person basis, a person in the United States emits almost 5 times the emissions of a person in China. But something the US and China have in common is their reliance on coal. Our two countries use more coal than any others and are the largest coal consumers and producers in the world, relying on coal for substantial shares of our electricity generation and primary energy consumption. But of course, China consumes coal at over twice the coal of the United States and is building new coal-fired power plants at a rate that we've really never before seen around the world. And when you look at this, the fact that it's very likely China and the US are going to continue to burn coal into the near future, you must consider options for capturing the carbon dioxide emissions from coal-fired power plants. Although as of right now, there are no full-scale commercial carbon capture and storage plants in operation in either country, several plans underway to potentially do some demonstration projects. And I think it's important to point out that in China in particular, there's very little incentive to capture the carbon emissions from coal power, not just due to the high cost of doing so, but also to the energy penalty associated with running carbon capture and storage equipment. It takes electricity to capture the emissions to store them underground, and this penalty could perhaps be as much of a third of the electricity coming out of a coal-fired power plant. So you've probably heard the statistics that China's building approximately 2 large coal power plants a week. They would need to be building 3 roughly to get the same amount of electricity out of these plants if you were capturing the carbon emissions. Of course, emissions in both the United States and China are growing. China's in particularly growing quite rapidly. But we really have very little understanding of where China's emissions might be headed in the coming years, and really of even where they are today. This graph shows some projections that the US Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration makes every year. And as recently as 2004, they were projecting when emissions in China might surpass those of the United States. This is the red line on the bottom. And in 2004, it was looking like this would not happen until sometimes after 2030. Okay, so really far down the road. We now know this actually happened in 2007. So our projections were really far off, and not just the US projections, China's own projections were extremely far off. And I point this out because I think it's important to keep this in mind when thinking about the type of commitment that a country like China might be able to agree to in the context of the United Nations Convention and the international negotiations. It's very hard for them to quantify where their emissions are today, let alone where they'll be down the road. And of course, when you're talking about quantifiable targets, it's very hard to have a country agree to a target if they have a lot of uncertainty about where their future emissions might be headed. So that's a bit of the gloomy side of the picture, but of course, China has actually done quite a bit to deal with climate change domestically. We've already heard about some of the activities happening there earlier today. China has ratified the major international agreements on climate change, but of course, as a developing country, is not bound to quantified emissions reductions. They are, in fact, the largest source of clean development mechanism projects, and China has released pretty aggressive national climate change plans over the last couple of years. This chart shows really the variety of actions that are taking place in China, many of which have already been discussed here. A couple that I think are particularly notable are a national level target to reduce the energy intensity of the overall economy, which has really, and there's been all sorts of programs mobilized throughout China aimed at achieving this target, including a program that targets the top 1,000 energy consuming enterprises in the country. Of course, very aggressive renewable energy activities taking place there as well. A national renewable energy law, something we don't yet have in the United States. And of course, China now becoming one of the largest manufacturers of wind turbines and already of solar photovoltaic panels in the world. Now turning to the United States and what's happening there. April in particular was an exciting month in Washington for people who work on climate change. In fact, for people who were in Germany at the first intersessional this year in Bonn, this was the first United Nations international negotiation where the Obama administration showed up as the representative of the United States position. And we also had, at the end of March, the Waxman-Markey American Clean Energy and Security Act draft discussion released, and this has really been the focus of a lot of activity in Washington over the last few weeks, numerous hearings and discussions. This timeline is actually in flux, but it's looking like this bill is going to be moved through markup over the next couple of weeks with the target of Memorial Day. We also had a powerful decision come out of the EPA. They issued their endangerment finding saying that CO2 is an endangerment to public health and really opening the door for the Environmental Protection Agency in the U.S. to now regulate CO2. This is significant in several respects, but in particular, I think it provides a signal that the administration now could move on regulating CO2 through EPA. This perhaps gives a bit of a push to Congress if they are the ones who are going to step in to move a bit more quickly. And then, of course, the Major Economies Forum was convened for the first time by the Obama administration. This is the group that was initially started under the Bush administration to bring together the major economies of the world, which represent, I believe, almost 90% of emissions, to talk about some of the issues directly parallel to those being discussed in the international climate negotiations.